From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out on a beautiful but blustery March evening in Washington, D.C. My name is Rob Casper. I'm the head of the Poetry and Literature Center here at the Library of Congress, and I want to welcome you to tonight's event. Last fall, the Poetry and Literature Center launched a new series, Literary Birthday Celebrations, to honor some of our country's greatest writers. We have already held 4 events in this series and are thrilled to count this as our 5th. And we are very excited tonight's event features one of our former consultants in poetry, William J. Smith, to read from his new book, My Friend Tom, the poet-playwright Tennessee Williams, on Williams's 101st birthday. I would like to offer a special thanks to the University Press of Mississippi and to its assistant director, marketing director, Stephen B. Yates, without whom this event would not be possible. I would also like to let you know that My Friend Tom will be for sale along with 2 of William J. Smith's poetry collections. Mr. Smith will be happy to sign books after the event. Let me ask you now to check your cell phones and electronic devices and turn them off. They do interfere with the mic, so it's good to have those off. And let me also take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about the Poetry and Literature Center. For the past 75 years, we have been the home to the consultant in poetry, now called the Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry. We also put on literary readings, lectures, and panels of all sorts throughout the year. If you would like to find out about more events like these, and I believe we have literary birthday celebrations for Walt Whitman and Gwendolyn Brooks coming up later on in the spring and summer, you can pick up one of our spring events flyers, which are outside where the books will be, and sign our sign-up sheet. We'll have a sign-up sheet by the signing table, and there's one outside there too. And you can also visit us at our website, which is www.loc.gov/poetry. You can read about both Tennessee Williams and William J. Smith in your program, which you should have on your chair. It is always a cause for celebration when one of our consultants or Poets Laureate returns to the center. We are honored to have William J. Smith back to the library that was his home from 1968 through 1970. And we celebrate his long-standing contribution to American letters, the latest of which is this account of Smith's old friend and one of America's great literary luminaries. Please join me in welcoming William J. Smith.
I was planning to stand at the podium, but I'm afraid that I would begin to fall in on my face. So I'm going to sit, and I hope you'll all be able to see me. And my voice will carry, I think, because I'm all digitalized now. I mean, I have something in my pocket that's I guess takes me around the world. So anyway, it's a great honor to be here after so many years. I wanted to come for the celebration of the anthology recently published of the Poets Laureate, but I wasn't able to make it. I wasn't able to make it here nor to the event in New York. But I've signed copies of that. But I'm told if I had been here that night, I would have had to sign some 40 copies for the library, in addition to anybody else who's wanted anything signed. So that was a kind of signing of the evening that I'm not accustomed to these days. But I brought my little sweater along because I usually get a cold neck. And this morning, with the wind, it was rather cold. So I'm, you know, it seems strange tonight, very peculiar to be here, because, and I see so many familiar faces. In fact, a good part of my family's here. I think that if I start to count them, I mean, they may take up perhaps too much of the audience. So that's a little embarrassing for my stature, shall we say, but it's great to see them. They're wonderful faces. In fact, a good many of them are thanked at the acknowledgments here in this book. I think I thanked everybody who's ever come near my house or near my library, because I've worked on this book for so long, because I'm one of the few people who now is alive, I think, who knew Tennessee Williams before he was Tennessee Williams. Thomas Lanier Williams and I were students together at Washington University in St. Louis. And I met him in 1935, and we were constantly together between 1935 and 1940. After that, I went off to the war, and came back. When I came back, the great play, the Glass Menagerie, just opened in New York. And it was one of the first things that getting back from my long years of service in the Navy, the first thing I did was take the train to New York, and I went to see the Glass Menagerie. And of course, it was a strange feeling, because I had spent so many years in the house that he depicts so beautifully in this play. I knew them all. And they were so incredibly presented by the greatest actress, of course, I've ever seen, Laurette Taylor. And then I was so moved by the whole performance that I walked out of the theater, and I was just sort of ready to fall, you know, just to fall on my face. I looked across, over in the corner, over on the edge of the street, there was Tom Williams. And so it was just as if we had gone on during those whole war years. But of course, I wondered, is this guy going to be the same to me now that he is famous, now that he's made so much money? And of course, he was exactly the same and with me, and he was the rest of his life. When he came to see me and my first wife in Florence, he was absolutely warm and greeting, and then we met each other over the years, sometimes when he gave a reading publicly, or when he was in the Academy of Arts and Letters, to which I was elected after he was. And I said to him, I greeted him and said, I think you had something to do with this. He said, well, I voted for you. And so he did. Anyway, I thought that I would begin by reading what is called the preface here. You know, the publishers always want to have writers do all their work for them by telling what the book is all about. And so I really took this very seriously. And so I wrote this preface in 2010. And I put it down, and I thought, well, they can just quote from this. And they said, no, this has got to be the beginning of the book. And so now that I have had some friends around the country who bought the book, they said, well, they've read it. To anybody who hasn't bought it, they read this preface, which gives it's so exciting, they said, that they're sure that it's going to send people right to the bookstore if there aren't any bookstores left. Anyway, they'll get it on Amazon, which it costs so much less anyway. But anyway, this is what I thought I would take the trouble to begin reading this. And if I have difficulty, it's because I suffer from pollen. And in fact, I don't know whether I can, I will be having a post-nasal drip during the whole evening. So forgive me if that happens. But I can't really convince my wife that there is such a thing as suffering from pollen. But when we went together to Rome, when we spent 4 months there in the spring, and I was a resident there, I had a wonderful time. They gave us the biggest apartment in the place, and we had the highest ceilings in the place and a beautiful lookout over the garden. Of course, it turned out to be the coldest spring ever in Rome, so we were freezing in that vast. It was then when it got warm and everything blossomed out. I was like everybody in Rome. I was suffering from this the pollen in the air, and I went to a doctor to see, and he said, go to the counter and then buy this drug, which is here you can't get it over the counter. These are drugs, which I know, but I don't take them any longer. I try to just stick with Claritin. But anyway, here we go. Oh, and I begin by saying what I've been saying for a long, long time, and that this is not a long book, but it has been long in the making. When my friend Thomas Lanier Williams, became immediately famous in 1945 as Tennessee Williams with the phenomenal success of The Glass Menagerie, he regularly gave my name to reporters, editors, theater and film critics, biographers, teachers, to anyone, anywhere, who was, he thought, seriously interested in learning about the beginning of his extraordinary career. For more than half a century, I have been responding to questions of every sort put to me by people of every sort from every corner of the world concerning the early years of the great American dramatist who was completely unknown when we first met at Washington University in St. Louis 75 years ago. Tennessee Williams spent his first 7 years in Mississippi, but for the rest of his life, Missouri and the city of St. Louis were. It's so strange. I have a light which is hitting me right in the wrong place, but pardon? Is there, I guess there's nothing that can be done about that. I mean, or can you twist it away in any way? No, maybe it's. Oh, that's marvelous. It's wonderful. Now, I feel that I'm alive again. I thought I was on television. But now, so I'll go back now. Tennessee Williams spent his first 7 years in Mississippi, but for the rest of his life, Missouri and the city of St. Louis, where he now lies buried, were for the most part physically or imaginatively his residence. I was a close associate of his there from 1935 to 1940, when we were both students, I a freshman and he a senior at Washington University, and where he produced his first two full-length plays. Poet Clark Mills, actually his full name was Clark Mills McBurney, also a university senior, and I met with the poet playwright Tom frequently, often as often as 3 times a week at his home on Pershing Avenue, a few blocks from the campus. We read our poems to one another, feeling as true poets do, poetry must be heard before it can be committed to the page, and of course before it can be recited on the stage. And when not reading in his living room, I looked and listened, and thus got to know Tom well, and became familiar with all the sights and sounds that he confronted every day and night in that household he depicted so forcefully in The Glass Menagerie, and to which, in his imagination, he returned throughout his life in other plays, poems, and stories he created. I remember his indomitable mother, Edwina, ushering us like some contented, commanding Confederate general into an antebellum mansion with the honey-coated, steady, monotonous, and maddeningly unstoppable voice that Laurette Taylor, in the character of Amanda Wingfield, caught perfectly. The madness in her speech that extended out over the entire household she dominated was echoed from time to time in her talented son's dark down home Delta drawl, when, cut by the cool blade of gallows humor, it erupted in uncontrollable laughter that resounded along the shelves on either side of the fireplace and shook dust from the books they contained. I carry with me the vision of the lonely, lovely, forever lost Sister Rose, drifting in from the shadows, her shrill, persecuted voice ruffling the air and rippling her beaded blouse as she flees the determined, drunken drumbeat of the heavy, stylishly footed, hard-drinking salesman father Cornelius. Now I say that when I say the heavily, stylishly footed, he was, of course, a shoe salesman, and he was a sales manager at the time of one of the greatest shoe factories in the States. It so happens that I'm wearing tonight my favorite shoes, which are Hush Puppies, and maybe some of you know them. I wore them years ago. It's the lightest shoe you can put on your foot. It's like lifting no shoe at all. And so they're the ones that I wear. And the shoes that were, at that time, produced by the firm that was, where Tennessee Williams was made to work by his father after being sent to the University of Missouri for 3 years. And after having flunked ROTC, he was brought back and made to work in the shoe factory. And of course, he's written about that, and maybe some of you read accounts he's written about writing poems on the back of a shoebox. Anyway, everything in St. Louis seemed to be connected at that time with shoes, if not with shoes, with beer, because we had, of course, the greatest brewery in the world, and of course, a lot of that beer was being made, but most of the time, at the time I was there and grew up just south of St. Louis at Jefferson Barracks, as my father was in the regular army. I'd come up from Mississippi and Louisiana where I was born. And I thought that I was a Southerner, and I lost my Louisiana speech because my mother was a very, very keen person about getting me to do the right kind of thing. And so she sent me to a coach who had gone to the University of Chicago and wanted to prepare me for the stage. So I lost all my accent, and since then I've been to Columbia University and Oxford, and everybody thinks that I'm English, and of course I I still talk in a way not. I think I do speak English so that it is as articulate as it is when it's spoken by our current president. But I'm not English. But anyway, this man Cornelius was a great. Well, he was a great, very good person, but and I think that Tom realized this later on, because he was very abusive to him, and also quite much of a drunk. I mean, he drank constantly, and as my father did. So I know something about that and about what happens when people get a little bit too much to drink. And of course, in his case, it was a little bit, went farther than it did in the case of my father, who was a corporal in the band and played the clarinet. So when he wasn't playing the clarinet, he was gambling. When he was not marching with a band, he was gambling or drinking. And he came home one night and had a lot to drink, and he didn't usually bring much money home. And my mother, who was very, very beautiful, also was a maker and designer of clothes, and so she worked for the officers' wives and made money that kept the wolf from the door. But my father played and loved poker, and I discovered in writing this book, actually, that poker comes from a German word pochen, which means something very savage and that involves violence. And I suppose that seems to happen with poker. In the case of my father, he came home this one night when he made some money, made a lot of money, and there were greenbacks, coming out of his pockets even. And he had too much to drink. Somebody had given him a lot of a very hard liquor, or then so he had, as all Army Corps people had at that time, had his own pistol, and so he'd shot up our porch, and then came in and fell on the floor, and all of this money was out in front of him on the floor. And I was 4 years old at the time, and I saw this, witnessed this. And I thought I carried this picture for my whole life, and finally I wrote a poem about it. And I'll say the poem, but I'll tell you first about what Tom did with his father, Cornelius. Cornelius was used to be, well, he liked selling shoes, and he was very pleasant as long as he went around the countryside in the South, in the Mississippi. So, but when he was brought to St. Louis and put in front of a desk where he had to just talk to salesmen and tell them what to do, Tom got the feeling afterwards that he could understand why he hated the whole thing, and would have wanted to do what Tom himself had wanted to do, to climb the roof and jump off. But on the other hand, what would get his way of working out the result was to get together with some of the other people and play poker. And of course, poker would sometimes lead to, as the name indicates, to some violence. In this case, one of the people at the table that they were playing with chewed off one of his ears. So that, this is not a little more than you usually expect to have happen. So he was taken off to Barnes Hospital in St. Louis, which is one of the greatest hospitals in the world. And of course, then his ear was remade. And Tom, of course, was haunted by this scene, as I was, and I didn't know the full, I didn't know this in quite such detail as I do now at that time, because he didn't want to talk about it even with his close friends. But I knew what had happened, more or less. But I know afterwards what he went, after the Glass Menagerie, he went, and some of the actors in the play, in the Glass Menagerie, were asked to come to his hotel room and to play poker, and he would provide all the beer and all the wine and whatever they wanted, and also the cards, and then he would stay there and walk around the table and learned how to play poker because he didn't know anything about it. And he learned very well, and he got to be himself. By the end of his life, he was a very good poker player. But what he did with it in his work was to write A Streetcar Named Desire, and which is, centers around the poker table with the poker players, and that was his way of doing it. Well, I don't want to. I didn't write this book, by the way, as I was afraid some people thought that I wanted to increase my reputation just because I knew Tennessee Williams. I do feel that our paths crossed, but I tried to leave out, in any case, my references in the book, which were in any too positive a way reflected on myself, because I wasn't writing about myself. But the paths crossed, and so now I can tell you what I wrote with my father's scene of violence. I think some of you who know my work know the poem. It's called American Primitive. And as you'll see, I took this scene that I carried for so many years and put it about 100 years earlier in the South, as it was, actually. And it goes like this, American Primitive. Look at him there in his stovepipe hat, his high-top shoes, and his handsome collar. Only my daddy could look like that, and I love my daddy like he loves his dollar. The screen door bangs, and it sounds so funny. There he is in a shower of gold. His pockets are stuffed with folding money. His lips are blue, and his hands feel cold. He hangs in the hall by his black cravat. The ladies faint, and the children holler. Only my daddy could look like that, and I love my daddy like he loves his dollar. Well, it's with my, I'm going to say emphysema, which I have as well. I have a hard time breathing but also, anyway, this poem has been brilliantly painted. I didn't know that people would take a subject like this, but it was done by a painter, I'm now, because of this walking too far today, I'm going to forget his name, but anyway, it's a beautiful image there. Well, I'm going to go on with the whole thing of this little introduction, and then we'll go on to some poetry, because I want to talk to you about Tom as a poet, and particularly the poetry in his plays. Then I guess I just ended up with Cornelius, and up behind Cornelius marches the skinny, uniformed little busybody brother, Dakin, back from his ROTC training session in the field house of the university. And actually, although Tom, who was actually 7 years older than I, because he'd been 3 years at the University of Missouri, and Clark Mills McBurney, who was the other one of our little, what Tom called our poetry club, was 5 years older, and I was the kid. And as I'll tell you in a minute of why Tom refers to me as a kid. I want to record the continuing presence in my mind of Tom's family members who appear in one form or another in almost all his work, and of his two early influential friends, Clark Mills, the poet, and Willard Holland, the actor and director of the theatrical troupe that presented his plays, and the female members of our poetry club who turned up in them. I wish to call back the riverfront of St. Louis as it then was during the Great Depression, with the Hooverville shacks on the edge of the Mississippi, there below Eads Bridge, as important to Tom as Brooklyn Bridge had been to Hart Crane, and to provide some sense of the entire fog-bound, polluted city that he examined so carefully and to which he gave literary permanence. And this fog-bound, polluted city, it was absolutely polluted because at times during the 30s when I was there, you would try to drive down through the city and you could not see anything. It was that because it's in, St. Louis is in a sugar bowl, and it's amazing what they've done over the years, that they've been able to eliminate the smog that once gathered at the bottom of this city and made absolutely, this was what made it seem for us such a horrible place to be. Actually, it was one of the most advanced cities in the world. It had one of the best public high school systems in the country. And Tom came up at the age of 7 from Mississippi. And I had come up at the age of 3 from Louisiana, but I went back from time to time, as he did, to Mississippi. And I went with my cousins who were also to Mississippi. But we both went to the schools there, and we had teachers who encouraged us very much with our writing. And so when I came, when we started to meet in St. Louis, I had already sent poems to magazines, and I'd had some printed in magazines, and he had also been sending everything out because he was determined from the very beginning that he was going to write. He had been, when we met in 1935, well, I tell you first of all, I get ahead of myself, but what this whole book is based on is the fact that I knew him from the very beginning. When he came to St. Louis, he had not published anything that was recognized anywhere except in Weird Tales. He published one story, and that was all that was. But then at the University of Missouri, he had published. He had 1 or 2 stories published in the little magazine, the paper of the college, and then he had presented drafts of plays, and those won some mention, but he had never actually had a play produced at the college. And when he came to St. Louis, one of his first plays that he had ever produced was on the way there to St. Louis. He stopped in Memphis with his grandparents, the Reverend Dakin, and there's a little group playing, and they made up with a friend of the family there. He made up a little play, and that was presented. That was the first thing that he'd written before he got to St. Louis. But now you see, I ramble on this way, and then I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. I mean, I really don't know where I am, so forgive me if I jump from place to place. I do have something in mind and I am going from place to place. What I mean to say is I want you to know what happened so that what I knew and where he was in the various stages of his life. And in this case, he had his first plays were presented in St. Louis. I was there in 1937 on the first evening of Candles to the Sun, it's called. And we had been meeting at his house, Clark Mills, and Clark Mills McBurney was at that time one of the leading poets in the country, and he'd been published at that time wherever, well, he was somebody like Elizabeth Bishop, who at that time wasn't quite as well known, but she was, they were all members of what was called, I'm thinking of the poets throughout the country who were members of what was called the College Poetry Society. And this had been established by a woman named Winslow, and her real name was Grubbs. If you have a name like Grubbs, I suppose you do want to make it, do something with it. So she was in Idaho, which is also the last place I think you would expect to have somebody establish a poetry a group. She wrote to every university in the country, and she not only wrote to the university, but she said, do something, you have talented people there, get them to write poetry, and so forth. So every major college established a college poetry society. Then she not only did that, but she had established poets who would then agree to serve as judges on the contests. And so we all sent our poems into the college verse. And this was where Clark Mills was first published, but then he went on to publish in many other places, like then Voices and other things that were, and other things that were better known. And then when it was actually this College Poetry Society that brought the three of us together, because Tom had been a member of the College Poetry Society at the University of Missouri. And in fact, there were not many, he says at one time in his memoirs, he says this, have I told you, Tennessee Williams asked in his memoirs, that at Washington University we had a little poetry club. It contained only 3 male members. The rest were girls, pretty, with families who owned elegant houses in the country. The 3 male members were Clark Mills McBurney, who, as Clark Mills, was already nationally known as one of the country's most prominent poets, Tom, then Thomas Lanier Williams, and I. As I said, Tom had been a member of the College Poetry Society in Missouri, and for some reason, this is what nobody can quite understand, because this is the last person one would think would be made treasurer of that organization. He was made treasurer of the Missouri chapter, and they bought a ledger for him to put down. And of course, then he was kicked out the following year because his father wouldn't let him stay, you see. So he brought that with him, and so he had the ledger that he'd bought, and so he just then used the rest of that particular one to begin his own diary, which he kept. He even kept from us. He never even showed it to Clark or to me. And it was fascinating. Some of you who followed his work know that Yale University published the complete diaries of Tennessee Williams, which come to something like this. And actually, it's all fascinating because he tells exactly what he thought was happening to him, and most of the time nothing very good was happening, and also he tells all the truth about everybody else because he was very truthful all the way through in all of his work. And one thing his plays were about was the fact that nobody was telling the truth. In the case of A Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, I mean, you remember that when Big Daddy speaks to Sister Woman, he talks about lying, about what is the word I want? Mendacity. Yes, right. And I'm sorry that I can't. That's then he's mendacity, and Sister Woman says, mendacity. Why, Big Daddy, I don't think I know what that means. And then he said, what it means is, it means that you're lying. And of course that is it. He was talking about people who lie the whole time. And of course now, it would be impossible for Tennessee Williams to be writing his plays because everybody in public life is lying constantly, every day, every minute, every second. So it was bad enough as it was then for all of us as artists, but now it's pretty ghastly. Anyway, to go on with that, I would just skip now to a little bit of this, where when we met at his house, we also thought we knew about his sister, Rose, and we saw her occasionally, but it was just once in a while that she drifted in and we knew at the time that she was having some mental difficulty, but of course it was became more profound than we knew at the time. But I want to give you a scene from my book, which is also based on something that he wrote in his own memoirs. But I think will tell you something about him as a poet. And I'm not going to go on forever now. Well, I still have a few minutes to go, I think, and then I'll stop. But we knew something about Tom's career. We knew something about Tom's sister, Rose, but we rarely saw her when we came to the house. We were aware that she was undergoing treatment for her mental condition, although we did not know, as even Tom himself did not then know, how very serious her condition was, and how a few years later she would undergo a prefrontal lobotomy. On one occasion, when his parents were away on a holiday in the Ozarks, Tom invited Clark and me and another friend, Willie Wharton, to share some whiskey with him. Clark had known Wharton at the university and found him amusing. I did not. He had little to say of any interest, but he never stopped talking. At the time, he was married to Minerva Prim, a former debutante, who stayed at home with their little baby. Wharton would take us up to their apartment and seemed to enjoy having us listen to their uninteresting and interminable arguments. I saw him years later, much subdued and married to a nurse who appeared to be able to manage him better than Minerva had. The evening at Tom's, after several drinks, Willie began making obscene telephone calls to people whose names he had picked at random from the phone book. I have a vision in my memory of Rose appearing suddenly on the stairs in a fluffy white dress and outraged threatening to tell her parents when they returned about what was happening. This she did to Tom's great distress. After he had tattled on my wild party, as the playwright later recounted in his memoirs, when I was told I could no longer entertain my first group of friends in the house, I went down the stairs as Rose was coming up them. We passed each other on the landing, and I turned upon her like a wildcat and hissed at her, "I hate the sight of your ugly old face." Wordless, stricken, and crouching, she stood there motionless in a corner of the landing as I rushed on out of the house. This was the cruelest thing I have done in my life, I suspect, and one for which I can never properly atone. I think this is the one place in prose where he said what he said very often in his plays. He didn't know, as I say at the time, how really very serious this was. Of course, she did undergo a prefrontal lobotomy, one of the very first that was performed, actually, because this was, St. Louis has always been a great world-renowned medical center. And this was in 1943, at this time when this scene that I just wrote about here, took place. This was in 1937, and when Rose was a schizophrenic, and she was put away in Farmington Center, which was a kind of hospital, but a clinic, you know, and she was put up there, and she wasn't at all happy there, and actually. Tom went to see her when she was there, and this was, he wrote at the time about this particular scene, and this was one of the first poems that I think a major poem that he first wrote, and I'm going to read that. Because we discovered that we knew Clark first as a poet, and I knew that he was going to make a name for himself, but I didn't realize that he would be as a playwright, because one, he did read some of his plays to us, and one of them was called Ishtar, and this was a Babylonian fantasy. And it was this was an attempt at writing in verse and a love story, in a Persian love story. And I quote in the book, I won't, but you may be interested to see that some of the lines quoted were simply ghastly, unbelievably awful. So Clark and I burst out laughing. And then, you know, Tom had expected to have this read and understood as a beautiful play, but he realized how impossible the language was. And he said, "Oh, I'll go and tear it all up." Of course, he never tore it up. He never tore anything up because he thought, well, someday, you know, maybe there's something here that can save. And then, of course, his mother picked everything up, and that's why you have so much of the Williams material still available in at Texas and at the University and at Columbia and various other places because she had saved it, and many of the things that he would have wanted to throw out. But actually, well, what we discovered was that when we saw his plays, Clark and I saw his plays, the first full-length play was about coal miners in Alabama. Well, this, you know, he knew the language that they spoke because he had a great ear, and he knew how people in Alabama and in the coal mines would speak, and they spoke just as they would, and it's perfectly correct, but it also has that rhythm, which is what he got in all of his plays, which is really poetry, because some of the speeches are actually, they would be printed as prose poems, in any other case. And very often he took he was a lyric poet, and he took some of his lyrics and put them into the plays. But I'm going to read this one that he wrote then about Rose when she was at the pharmacy and at the Missouri, Farmington was called, yes. It's called The Beanstalk Country. You know how the mad come into a room too boldly, their eyes exploding on the air like roses, their entrances from space we never entered. They're always attended by someone small and friendly who goes between their awful world and ours, as though explaining, but really only smiling, a snowy gull that dips above a wreck. They see not us nor any Sunday caller among the geraniums and wicker chairs, for they are jacks who climb the beanstalk country. Composed of hammers and tremendous beams, compared to which the glassed solarium in which we rise to greet them has no light. The news we bring them, common, reassuring, drenched with the cheerful idiocy of noon, cannot compete with what they have to tell that they saw through cracks, and what they saw through cracks in the ogre's oven. And we draw back, the snowy someone says, don't mind their talk, they are disturbed today. That's a really frightening poem. I'm sorry I read it so badly, but I printed it, copied it from the book, but I made some typewritten mistakes or tried to redo them, when the copy didn't come through correctly, and so I can't even read. Of course, I've reached that point in life, and none of you have got there yet, where I can't read my own writing. I used to write long letters by hand, and I still do, but nobody can read them at all, so I give them to a typist. Anyway, it's frightening, very frightening poem. And then, of course, like all of his work, it does have its absolute base in what has happened, and that is that the actual one who becomes a snowy gull that dips above a wreck. This is the little friendly, smiling creature who introduces you to those people who are ill. This actually was said by his sister when she was pointing to one of the patients who was under the table or something in a catatonic state. And then she said to Tom, don't bother, don't be annoyed about this. She's just one of her bad days. So actually it's incredible what he did is take this so that the actual person presenting the mad creature is actually mad himself. So it's a kind of wonderful change that he makes. Now I'm going to end with one little very short poem, a very different type of poem, but it shows some very aspects of his writing. And then I'll be happy to answer any questions. I think we may still have a little time to do that. And I've been very interested since I had this book came out just about since the 1st of February. I've spoken several times in New England, and I've very often had some wonderful questions. I mean, people, I think when they want to, they can ask very, very sensible questions. I found when I was teaching that most of the time they didn't. But anyway, now they seem to. Anyway, in this case, I'm going to read this poem, which is called Kitchen Door Blues. And this is one of the little ones that he wrote for music. And he wrote a number of pieces. Any Southerner, as you know, are like the country musicians, and everybody's writing music in the South in one way or another. And some of it's good and some of it's awful. But everybody sings it to everybody else. And of course, this is what he did, and he put down some, and he recorded, and many of you perhaps know those things, that they're very, very well done, and he does them beautifully. Well, this is one that he wrote, and it was a time done perhaps as a projected blues series of blues song for Libby Holman. But when late in life, when I asked him if I could have permission to use it in an anthology, he said, well, of course, but he said, you know that poem was my father's favorite work of all of the works I had done. And I think when you hear it, you'll understand why. And here it is. My old lady died of a common cold. She smoked cigars and was 90 years old. She was thin as paper with the ribs of a kite, and she flew out the kitchen door one night. Now, I'm no younger than the old lady was when she lost gravitation, and I smoke cigars. I look sort of peaked, and I feel kind of poor. So for God's sake, lock that kitchen door. Thank you very much. Thank you. I won't try to stand, but thank you very much indeed.
Thanks so much.
Wonderful.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Mr. William J. Smith, for that. A great talk. I wonder if there are just a couple of sensible questions out there. And just for the purposes of the taping, I'll have to repeat your questions. So go ahead.
I'll try to keep it short. I'm glad you're channel Tennessee Williams.
Yeah, right.
You alluded to the fact that Tennessee Williams called you a nice kid.
Yeah.
And he did ask you to do something. He would hope that you would do something upon his grave. I was wondering if you ever did get the chance.
Oh, well, yes, I think that was one thing I was going to read, and perhaps I will. Let's see, I can do that. It won't take long to find it. Yes, this was in 1939, when I was an assistant at the university then in French, the French department. And this is where I had moved, and it was really near the university. Went over to Bill's room at WU dorm. We wrote, I on a new one-act, which is rather feverishly, desperately flashy. Bill prepared his group for the poetry club. Some of his stuff is surprisingly good. He gets nice musical effects and good images, but comes down frightfully in some lines without realizing it at all. Still, Bill is a very nice kid, and I hope will make some kind of remarks over my grave. So I discovered that after in his journal after, and so that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, actually. And so I've tried to give a very sympathetic picture of him and not of the kind of monster that you get from Hollywood and the drug scene. And I think there was more to it than that. So, anything else?
Any other questions?
Oh, there must be something else.
Well, yes, hold on for a second. I'll bring this back.
Where do you think he got the sense of humor he had? Was it the father, the mother, or anybody in the family have that particular sense of humor? As in the poem you read about the kitchen door and so many other things you
Yeah,
wrote?
right. Well, I think, where does one get the sense? Well, I think, I don't, well, I think the father probably had it, but certainly not, no. No, I wouldn't say. He said some funny things, but I don't think he realized how funny they were. But, and certainly the mother didn't. The mother wanted to be, she'd always dreamt of being a singer, you know. I mean, actually, I think, and she had she did, when, it's only fair to say that she read him all the songs and so forth when he was a little boy. And so he really was exposed to all the great poetry. But I think, I don't know, I find it, well, I just noticed actually that when I arrived in Washington today, and well, one of the engineers came to the room because we couldn't figure out what was happening in the room, and it was just too cold. And he came, and he is a Southern man of color, and we became great friends all of a sudden, and he started to talk, and he had a tremendous sense of humor. And I think that's just there. I mean, it seems to me that it didn't come from anybody in the family particularly. I mean, and not actually in his family. I mean, the great antecedents of Tennessee that Cornelius was so proud of, so where we're not great humorists, you know. I mean, but of course, and modern writers, and one of the other characters in this book is Eudora Welty, who happened to be one of my other mentors in life, and who has the most marvelous sense of humor anywhere in the world, I think. So that's anyway, yes.
Did you know back in the 30s that you were going to write about this man one day? Did you keep a diary? Is your recollection of it vivid because you've just thought about it?
Well, I tell you, I've never done what he did and kept a journal, a diary day by day. What I've done is fill up notebooks with just whatever comes in my head. And I have a very good visual memory. And so I did, well, I think you read the Army Brat, which is based on many, many scenes from my childhood. I did in that case, if there was I was thinking of historical things, I went back and got the notes and everything else. But I didn't think of this, but I have done so much. I have so many notes, sometimes just on pieces of paper that, and as you've been in our house, so you know that nothing is thrown out, and that my dear, wonderful French wife gets it all packed up and put away out of everybody's sight, but still, when I'm working, it's all there, and I think that I did feel I wanted to say something about him before I knew that what was written here, but that was when I spoke in New Orleans once at a sort of festival. My friend Thomas Keith from New Directions Publishing House heard me speak, and he said, well, you know, speaks so well about this play, won't you write the introduction to it? And so they published that. The Candles to the Sun never appeared anywhere before, and I wrote about it because I remembered the whole. I have a very good memory a visual memory. I wanted to be a painter, and so I remember the evening. I remember what everybody looked like, and of course, I think part of that being having so many of relatives in the South and listening to them, my ear was trained too. I mean, I was a listener, as Eudora says, and he was a listener, and well, I think every good writer is a listener. Right. Yes.
Thank you. I know tonight's about Tennessee Williams, but I just want to say as a teacher, for 30 years I've been teaching American Primitive, and I think it's one of the most powerful poems ever written for young people. It just means so much. So I wanted to let you know that.
Oh.
But the other thing would be, when you and Tom, and we all did this kind of in college, you know, you're sitting there and you've had a whiskey or 7 or 9 or whatever, and you start talking about where you're going to go and what you're going to do.
Yeah.
I'm sure you didn't think you would be sitting here tonight necessarily addressing us. But what kinds of things did go through your mind? Because, I mean, you both were very extremely successful on so many levels. So, you know, in some ways the dreams came true, but take us back long before they happened. And you're just sitting there in conversation. You're writing, you're doing, and then what else is going
enough,
on?
I think it was, there was the most, and I think that one thing that we felt then, that the most talented guy was Clark Mills, and in fact, it's so in his memoirs, Tom says he says lists the 3 members of this poetry society, and he says, and in order of talent, they went from Clark to me to him, and you see he was the least talented. Of course, that's ridiculous because it probably was, you know, somewhat the other way around. Because actually, Clark may have shown us more talent than he had, but he himself even realized that he didn't have it in the end, and so he stopped writing actually. But I resurrected one of his poems in this book, as a matter of fact. But thank you for for my writing about the poem of the American Primitive. But I'm told that, you know, that's been in textbooks and written, well, as you know, with other poems, and students are asked to pick out the worst poem and they inevitably pick out mine.
Not in some New Jersey schools. maybe in those other 49 states.
In other, all right.
Not in New Jersey.
Okay, good. All right, I'm glad to hear that. But you know, because some they say that well, you know, this is no way to speak. I love my daddy like he loves his dollar. You can't talk like that. And then of course you realize that somebody who's subjecting to this does not realize that I'm written about a man who's hanged himself. You know, which is, and then of course, this has happened to me actually, with college students, and I was appalled, and I said, but you know, you're not looking at that, you're not listening to what the poem says. It says he hanged in his hall, he hangs in the hall by his black cravat, you know, and that was that line took me 5 years to write and to find. But I think it comes off, I hope that it comes off, just as if it was said in 5 minutes, you know. But that's the thing that I know that Tom wanted in his work too, to get, and you feel that on the stage, that as if this is not written. This is the way it was.
Okay, just one more question.
Yeah, all right.
Yes, I just want to ask what all his old friends thought when he changed his name to Tennessee Williams.
Well, I think they were mystified, as many people have been since, because he used to say at readings, he said, "I'll answer any question except why I chose the name Tennessee Williams." I think it was when he sent all of his poems, which were sent from Memphis as he was leaving to go for the first trip, one of his first trips back, and he had entered them in a contest. And this is where he also made his, it was supposed to be 4 years shorter than it, so he changed his birth date to enter the contest. Anyway, he won the contest, but he had stopped to see his parents and his grandparents, and those people he really adored, especially his grandmother. And he does write beautiful poems about her. And they're some of the very best. I hope someday somebody will print just a volume of poems, of lyrics of his, you see, because there's so many that are lying around in drawers. And when I went to look in Texas, where they are, there's so many things that could be put together just to be read for the value of the language, you know. But now I've got away from your question, though.
What did you all think of when he changed his name?
Oh, yes. Well, of course, I think that really what was behind him, he would never say what actually he had been thinking about. But I think that he really he wanted to remind himself of the best he came from. And that was from his Tennessee family, and this, of course, meant the poet that he's one of the poems of the South that he is. Was a great influence on him. Somebody, I've lost the name now again, I've just talked too much, and I've come on an airplane today, and plus driving for hours. And remember, but actually he was very proud of his Tennessee forebears, and he wrote, even for college verse, he wrote a long poem which is all about them, and they were very courageous people, and also then they were very much in the government too, and as well as a one, in the famous writer whose name wait a minute, Sidney Lanier, that's right, Sidney Lanier. He's called Thomas Lanier Williams. Well, Sidney Lanier, he said he didn't think that Lanier was very much of a poet, but he was an interesting man, an interesting character. The fact of the matter was that, I don't know if you know the work of Sidney Lanier, but he wrote the Marshes of Glynn, which is a marvelous poem, and it's one of those that's absolutely made up of sounds, and Tom used to know by heart a couple of stanzas of that poem. But I think also he was, of course, you remember that he was one. He was a rival of a great American, Whitman, but he was, because he had tuberculosis because of being in the war in the South. He wrote about the South as opposed to the North, and the South is always that South of beauty, and the North is that more of you know, a rigid intellect, and the South is more of emotion and feeling. And actually, that is what Tom really follows. And although this is what so many of the modern other writers in the South disdain, because they didn't want to have that, they didn't want to have that picture. But of course, the way it's presented, Tom is part of the humanity, not just the Southern scene, but that's really. So I think that's, anyway, thank you all again.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.